We know that there has been a lot of talk about the trade war that now Carney has wanted to implement on essentially Canada and Canadian citizens, but against the US because of the tariffs. However, Alberta seems to continue to be getting embroiled, but also helping with the independence with this whole talk of what's going to happen with the oil.
Many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
And Alberta has been positioned essentially at the center and taking center stage more and more, as both Doug Ford and apparently Mark Carney too are threatening to cut off oil from the US.
Well, the big question here is, Alberta going to become collateral damage in Mark Carney's trade war here? Does he want to try to use this oil as leverage? We know he's trying to interfere in the midterms at this point.
Western Standard says, quote, Smith says cutting off Alberta's energy exports is not a viable option.
Yeah, and this is the right stance to take, obviously, but I have two questions. Is she taking this stance because of the Alberta independence movement, knowing if she took the Canada First approach, which every single other premier is taking, that would push more people towards the polls to vote for independence? That's number one. Number two, how much control does she actually have over the oil? Obviously, all these pipelines from Alberta go into the United States, British Columbia, and other provinces. That gives the federal government a ton of control and say on what happens with the oil, which is a shame because I actually like this stance and I would love for Alberta to protect its oil and build a good relationship with the United States.
But there's also a big misconception that Alberta's oil is essentially Canada's oil. However, there has been talk by Keith Wilson and others, lawyer Keith Wilson, saying that, in fact, no, it is not Canada's oil. Alberta actually got a lot of rights to their own oil a while ago.
Alberta has all the rights to their oil, and that's the thing. Not until it crosses over these borders does the federal government get federal control, and it's implementing more and more federal control with these MOUs and these deals that basically Danielle Smith is signing away the economic sovereignty of Alberta at this point, and I don't like to see it. She's also paying retroactive carbon taxes on oil that's already been coming out of the ground that there was no carbon tax on.
And yet we see those that don't really care about Alberta and, however, are trying to fight against its independence by doing the exact opposite, like Jason Kenney, disgraced former Premier of Alberta. Global News says, quote, former Premier Jason Kenney is questioning why Alberta is taking oil and gas off the table in the high-stakes tariffs war with the United States, saying Canada has the power to really put the squeeze on America through energy exports.
Well, and I brought this particular article up and to point out not only Jason Kenney, but this is Naheed Nenshi, this is Doug Ford, this is the Canada First approach that every single other premier has. And if by some miracle the Federalists win on October 19th, I have a feeling Danielle Smith may want to take this exact same approach. This is absolutely ridiculous. You start a real energy war with the United States, it is not going to end well for Canadian citizens, for provinces, or for anybody else.
And especially for those that want to shackle Alberta still to Canada, because I think this is giving a great view of what actually happens when Alberta stays within Canada. It is used as leverage, and without really thinking of the consequences or who they're affecting, the people themselves, the citizens themselves.
Well, it's not just used as leverage, it's used, period. It's used for remittance payments, it's used to fund Canada, and it's used as leverage in a trade war with its oil and other natural resources. And on top of that, it's constantly being restricted, so it can't develop that leverage even if it wanted to.
But there's also further and further talk of Alberta's oil, maybe even Alberta itself, becoming collateral damage during this trade war that is essentially self-waged by Canada against the US. We see here from the Western Standard saying, quote, Alberta oil risks becoming collateral damage in Ottawa's trade war.
Now, I personally think this is a bunch of malarkey. Everybody knows the Alberta pipelines run into the United States, go all the way across the United States and back up to the Laurentian elites in Ottawa and Quebec. So the United States has just as much opportunity to turn off those pipelines as the federal government does. But this is the federal federalist approach, trying to act like they have fake leverage when they don't have any leverage. The United States is the one with all the leverage. And it seems to me, after all the leaks coming out from the American administration, they offered Canada the best deal of any nation on earth at this point. Now what I'm thinking is going to happen after the midterms, there's a good chance Donald Trump is going to take revenge for this foreign interference of Mark Carney in the midterms, cancel the USMCA, announce a bilateral deal with Mexico, and really put the punishment on Canada.
And the thing is, Canada, during all the brandish talk about saying, oh, but I'm the best negotiator, and saying that says Mark Carney, I'm going to make the best deal with the US. And that is essentially how he got elected, on the elbows up. I'll do whatever it takes for Canada. Didn't enter official trade negotiations like Mexico did, and hasn't entered them either at this point before he started waging this war against the US. So we don't even know fully what was said in those meetings, what was offered in those meetings from either side, and why they actually broke down.
Well, this is the dirty little secret Canada doesn't want to get out. It did leak out on one mainstream media outlet at the very beginning, but it was never mentioned again. And that was one of the terms Canada wanted to build into this deal, that they were responding to the 50% tariff from the United States, was to enter into official negotiations. And why is that important? Because you can put snapbacks and standstills in those negotiations. Those are mechanisms to protect Canada from future tariff threats from Donald Trump or the United States. The fact that they were never in official negotiations is the reason they were never allotted those protections.
But a lot of these premiers, and Mark Carney included, seem to forget how the oil and the transportation actually works, and why trying to use it as leverage against the US might not be such a good idea. Kirk Lubimov says, quote, I need to sober up some of the people in Eastern Canada and Ontario Premier Doug Ford and the elbows up crowd who is calling on Canada to cut oil shipments to the US or increase taxes. First of all, it's Alberta's oil, not Canada's. Get that through your thick skulls. Second of all, it's you in the Eastern Canada that imports oil and petroleum products from the US via the US. You are literally dependent on it.
Yeah, and again, if this trade war gets out of control, meaning they don't come to a deal before the midterms and Donald Trump wants revenge after the midterms, Mark Carney may declare the Emergencies Act at some point to bestow more power into the federal government's hands when it comes to oil and a lot of other things.
Further power. And again, it is Alberta's independence that is at the crux of all of this, because it is an existential threat. And we are seeing now why Alberta further is more important for the federal government, because they use it as leverage as well, not just amongst provinces with payments that go out to every single other province except Alberta, but also against the US, for example.
Well, this is why October 19th is so crucially important now more than ever. We need to send a message to Ottawa saying, don't interfere in Alberta, don't interfere in our sovereignty, don't try to use our oil as leverage. We have a good trade relationship with the United States. Currently, as it sits, it's Ottawa, Quebec, and BC that's most affected by this tariff war, not Alberta. It's the federal government that wants to drag Alberta through its oil pipelines and other trade mechanisms into this trade war.
However, we do see, and we did see, Doug Ford being very brash about, we're going to cut energy because Ottawa is one of the most affected provinces by these tariffs. However, he doesn't seem to really know much of anything, really. Table Salt says, quote, Doug Ford discovers that Canadian oil is shipped through the US back to Canada, saying, quote, I have to give credit to Danielle Smith. She came up with these ideas to reroute Canadian oil through Canada. This is unbelievable. They didn't know about this massive risk.
This is absolutely insane what's coming out of Doug Ford's mouth. The fact that he's threatening oil and he didn't even know the Americans are the ones that can shut off the oil to Eastern Canada at this point. And he starts talking about some pie in the sky dream of a west to east coast pipeline. That's decades long pipeline, especially with First Nations, other provinces, the federal government. I mean, you name it, everybody's going to want to cut. That will take decades to build. This trade war will be well over by then. And if you start building that pipeline after this trade war kind of ends, if a deal comes to fruition, the Americans aren't going to like it very much. And the Americans own 70% of Canadian oil.
On Monday, she's obviously still opposed to that idea. From your point of view, how did that conversation go? And is there anything you think you can do to get her on board with your approach?
Well, we had a great conversation. We get along quite well. We may disagree on certain items, but I'm going to be flying out there to pay her a visit. This is why we need the pipeline. We've needed this for God 50 years, going from west over to east, and we're going to work on that. We're going to work collaboratively with Alberta and Premier Wab Kinew. We have to get his approval, and Scott Moe, and everyone has to work together. I'm confident that's going to happen, but Premier Smith came up with some great ideas. Right now, we're getting our fuel and our natural gas coming down to the U.S. and coming back up to Canada. Craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. And the natural gas coming from Pennsylvania.
Craziest thing you ever heard in your life. Everybody in Western Canada already knows this. The fact that you're running your mouth off, making this trade war worse and worse, and you don't even know how these pipelines generally run from Alberta to the United States and back up to the east, which gives America a ton of leverage over Canada when it comes to its own oil. On top of that, like I just said, the Americans own 70% of Canadian oil.
Coming up, well, we already have an existing pipeline, so we're going to reroute that, and we won't have to be reliant on the U.S. Isn't that amazing that we have energy sovereignty? Once we build this pipeline, we won't have to rely on anyone in the entire world. And that's our plan, and we're going to go as quickly as possible. So we get along very well. Again, we may differ on a couple things, but we have a strong plan. And I got to give Premier Smith the credit. She was the one who came up with these ideas, that rerouting this natural gas line, and eventually rerouting Line 5 as well.
Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, this is a pie in the sky dream. This is a decade, maybe even 2 decades, if they even get it started at this point. And as soon as the trade war ends, they're going to stop talking about that east to west coast pipeline, because it's just too hard to get federal projects, especially large federal projects like this one, done in Canada because of Mark Carney and the Liberals.
And especially pipelines, we've already seen that the construction of them always get halted because of approvals by every single premier, approvals by the federal government, approvals by the First Nation, consultation periods. Then protesters come out, and then nothing ever gets done and just gets halted to please those that do continue to use fear and fear-mongering about oil and what's going to happen to the climate against these kinds of projects. So this probably will never get built. And if they manage to shackle Alberta to Canada, then it's going to be even less favorable for Alberta itself.
Yeah, there's other pipelines that are possible, but this east to west coast mega pipeline dream that Doug Ford is pitching as a solution to the Canadian public, they have no other solutions. That's why he's pitching this pie in the sky dream that will never happen as a solution.
And that's the thing, the utopian thinking of, oh, but we could do this and this. Meanwhile, currently, there isn't much no leverage for Canada, and yet they're threatening the U.S. with a bunch of different things, saying we're going to cut off our energy and our oil towards you. You can't, because that means you're cutting it off from yourself. Chuck Prendelli says, quote, Canada produces 6 million barrels of oil a day. Most of that flows through the companies wearing a Canadian flag. Look at who actually owns them. Imperial Oil is 69.6% owned by ExxonMobil. ConocoPhillips Canada is 100% U.S. owned. Chevron Canada is 100% U.S. owned. 70% of Canada's oil wealth ends up in America, and Canada just keeps 30%.
And we can take a quick look at this chart. And the important thing to see here is that little Canadian flag at the top that says 30%, and the American flag that says 70%. That indicates 70% of the oil coming out of Canada is already owned by the United States. And this is why Mark Carney wants carbon taxes and all kinds of other taxes put on oil pipelines, so he can get his cut and more of a cut every year before profits are kind of handed out to the U.S. or Canada or to whoever else.
The U.S. does own about 70% of Canada's oil, or at least ends up with it. They're also diversifying, and they're also looking at other avenues to get that oil, and not just including Venezuela, but many others too.
Well, they own that 70% because they invested in Canada when there wasn't these onerous restrictions in Canada that the Liberals put up. You're not going to see any kind of investment coming into Canada right now, except from one individual, and that is the Canadian federal government. You're seeing the federalization of not only natural resources, but you're going to see it in a lot of other sectors very soon.
And right now, Alberta being in the middle and being used as leverage once again, because it always ends up that way. Well, the talk of independence, and hopefully so on October 19th, will actually see a bigger response to the premiers, to Mark Carney, to Canada itself and the federal government, saying we can use Alberta just as leverage because we'll always have them, not including the existential threat of them leaving. Well, I hope more and more people realize that it is essentially up to Alberta at this point.
Well, the federal government wants to use Alberta as leverage. What Albertans want is freedom. And on October 19th, they're going to have the opportunity to get that freedom, or at least the first step to go towards a binding referendum here.
And we will continue to fight and support Alberta's independence. In the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe. It really does help us out, and like the video because that also really helps us out.